Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Griffin Art Projects is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, and Stolo nations, and we are honored and grateful to undertake our work here. My name is Jazz Keeler, and I'm the Contract Virtual Programs Curator with Griffin Art Projects. I have just a few super quick housekeeping notes before we jump right in and I hand things over to Emily. So first, I wanted to mention that if you would like to see live captions displayed for today's presentation, you can enable this by selecting the CC Live Transcription button at the bottom of your screen. And I always just mention that it's not super accurate with regards to names. So people names and place names tend to be trickier, but we do hope that it's helpful in capturing most of what we're saying today. I also wanted to mention that if you're having any issues with the Zoom interface, we'll also be live streaming today's event to Griffin Art Project's Facebook page, and I will just go ahead and post a link in the chat in just a moment so that you can also follow along on Facebook. So lastly, I just wanted to mention that we're using Zoom's webinar format today, and that just means that we can't see or hear audience members, but definitely feel free to get in touch using the chat button at the bottom of the screen. There's also plenty of room for audience questions, so if you have a question for Emily, please do feel free to type it in the Q&A dialog box, which is actually separate from the chat, or you can always ask your question out loud. If you would like the option to unmute, you can raise the yellow virtual hand and I'll know to unmute you. But I do always just mention that we're recording today's event. So if you ask your question out loud, it will just be captured on the audio recording. So those are all my housekeeping notes, and I'm really delighted to introduce Griffin's recent artist in residence, Emily Neufeld. So Emily was in the studio at Griffin for June and most of July, and she's actually joining us from Newfoundland today, where she's already jumping into her next residency project. Today, Emily will be sharing with us a presentation about her practice and some of the projects and research that she undertook throughout her time at Griffin. So thanks so much, Emily, for joining us here today, and it's a real pleasure to introduce you. So Emily was born in Alberta on Treaty 6 and 7 land and now lives and works on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam in North Vancouver. Her practice investigates place and how humans change and are changed by the environment, and the layers of memory and psychic history that accumulate in our material world. In addition to collaborative projects with other artists, recent solo exhibitions include Before Demolition, Tides 2019 at Eye Level in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Motherlands at the Pole in Den Haag, and Before the Demolition also in 2017 at the Burrard Arts Foundation, and Picture Window in 2016, the Vancouver Heritage Foundation, a large-scale billboard on the CBC wall in downtown Vancouver. And from August to October 2020, Emily presented a solo exhibition, Prairie Invasions, a Lullaby, at the Richmond Art Gallery. And Emily has created and participates in community sharing gardens and sees land as fundamental to her research process. And she has her BFA from Emily Carr University of Art and Design. So thanks so much, Emily, and I'll just pass it right over to you.
Thanks, Jess. It's very nice. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you from sunny Newfoundland today. It's just like a coast to coast kind of artist talk here. Yeah, I think, we have fairly, modest size crowd today, so we can be kind of casual. If you have any questions, put that virtual hand up and Jazz can, pop in and interrupt me, and I can answer questions kind of on the fly as well. But yeah, I think I'll just start by sharing my screen here and starting from a body of work that I made a few years ago for the Burrard Arts Foundation, and kind of just give a little context for the work that I did at Griffin. So I'm just going to start back up a little bit of time and yeah, start with kind of contextualizing my work. So I grew up, as Jazz mentioned in the bio, I grew up on the prairies in a farming on a farm, basically, in rural Alberta, where I would explore old farmhouses, abandoned farmhouses like this, quite regularly as a kid. I was always interested to, drive through the fields and take a look at these places and sort of photograph them. And so it's sort of always been something that's kind of burned in the back of my mind as like a place of curiosity, a little bit of a magical place to be. And so, I was traveling a lot even earlier in my art career, sort of looking at these spaces and then coming back and making sculptures kind of based on them. But then I realized at some point that there were so many houses being torn down in the Lower Mainland that I could maybe do a little less traveling and maybe, focus kind of close to home on some of the houses that were also being discarded or they were basically being demolished for the purposes of infills. And sometimes that was for densification, like, more condos and stuff. But a lot of the times, especially in North Vancouver, where I'm living, it's just, they don't like the house. And so people buy the land, knock down the house and just build another house that's probably bigger and more modern and such. So I was able to gain access to some of these houses, and I would look around in them for that human trace, for the way that the people who lived in them used them, or for the way that the trades people had built them, and then the renovations that had happened over time. A lot of them, started off as cabins, then got added onto. So there'd be really interesting kind of like construction techniques that are used, because outside walls become inside walls, and there's, sometimes, electrical gets changed or plumbing gets changed. So you can sort of cut into the walls and start to see some of that history within them. Some of the, the carpeting going over top of hardwood flooring and that sort of thing. And also just sort of for the spirit of kind of like the decor, the way that it was decorated or used. This house had, like, every room was a different sort of pastel color. And so cutting these windows in, you could sort of see through the different colors of all the different rooms and have them all at the same time in your vision. And then this is the show at the Burrard Arts Foundation when they were in their old space that I had, where I blew up these photographs of these homes that I had cut into these large adhesive wall vinyl photographs and stuck them on the gallery walls. And then I built figures from the building materials that I pulled out of the dumpster at the construction sites, and would make these sort of figures out of those materials to inhabit this space again. This was a rammed earth runner that went down the center of the room. And then again, the rest are all just these large vinyl adhesive photographs. And so this is in 2018, I went across the prairies and I made work again, back to the kind of that first idea, back to these farmhouses that are kind of falling down. And a lot of them even from when I was a kid until now, many of them are totally gone. You have to drive quite far out to find them now, and there's a lot less of them. So I went into the houses there and made interventions into those houses, and then documented that again. And this time I found that, whereas in the Lower Mainland, I was able to sort of do like a subtractive process of sort of cutting into the walls and taking things out to reveal other things. On the prairies, there's so much missing already in the houses that I found I was having to do more of like an additive process. So, adding the flowers to the wall, in the place where the wallpaper, there was roses and peonies on the wallpaper, and the wallpaper had kind of peeled off. And so I added these flowers and plants that I just collected from the ditches, brown-eyed Susans and poplar leaves and grasses. Or here we put a grass mat to rethatch the roof that had fallen. The roof had holes in it and was kind of falling down. This house is a subtractive process. We just cut that bottom corner of the house out, but then we brought the prairie through the corner of the house so that the land was, kind of penetrating into the house. And this is kind of what most of these houses look like on the inside. So it's a little bit, cutting into them is a little bit subtle. You wouldn't necessarily know that I had altered them. They look so kind of destroyed already. So there I was bringing objects in from farmyard, the plants that I found, the seeds, birds' nests, these things, and placing them in the space and then documenting that. And then this was the exhibition at the Richmond Art Gallery. So, you know, again, large scale photographs put on the wall like wallpaper, and again, made grass mats and thatched a wall with grass mats. And then I made these large panoramas, light boxes, but they're kind of like inside out panoramas. They're panoramas that have been sort of turned inside out and placed on the round. So you have to walk around them to kind of experience the entire like horizon. Yeah, so, you know, this leads me to the Griffin, where I'm starting research for yet another body of work into abandoned resource extraction towns. So I'm heading into some ghost towns in BC, where there's been a lot of resource extraction, and I'll be making work in the houses that I find there. So this was a bit of a like material exploration / like a COVID kind of timeout process that I began. I started making these sculptures that are a much smaller scale that I could do kind of in my studio during COVID. Also began doing more drawings and kind of, you know, re-exploring that as just like a, you know, a nice thing that artists do, which is draw, and kind of like a meditative process that helps you kind of look at things and slow down your brain a little bit. So it was a very productive residency for me. I made a lot of things, including these, which are polypores. So they're like a fungi, sometimes they're called artist conchs, and they grow on trees that are rotting. So they kind of aid in the process of breaking down trees that have fallen. And they, you know, fill them with their mycelium, and then they help the tree to rot. And so I'm thinking a lot about, you know, when, in order for a forest to grow, or in order for kind of like, you know, things to flourish, there has to be death and entropy and kind of rot. And someone, you know, the death of a tree is life for a conch, and then the conch turns the tree into soil that the tree can grow out of. And some of these simple cycles that, you know, I think people try very hard to avoid. So kind of this act of freezing them or casting them in this clear resin sort of stops that process. And now this thing that's supposed to be in this cycle is sort of like frozen in time, which to me is similar to what a photograph does, or similar to what like maps do, and some of these other objects I'm hoping to use in this work across BC is I want to use maps. And I do take these photos of like this certain moment of a house being demolished. It, you know, tomorrow could look different, or a month from now looks very different, and a month earlier it looked different as well. And so when you sort of freeze it in time, it's sort of giving it some kind of immortality, but also robbing it of some kind of like life cycle. So I've taken these conchs and cast them, and then I put gold leaf on the inside of them, or on the what would be the bottom, and these ones have got silver leaf on them. And my plan is the light really hits this resin in a really interesting way and kind of like casts different like reflections or shadows on the wall. So I'm planning to take these to a silver mining town and gold mining town, and install them on the remains of some of the log cabins that are kind of falling down there, and put lights in behind them so that they're kind of lit up and kind of glow. And that's one of the projects I'm planning to do in the near future. So I was able to get a bunch of these created kind of while I was at Griffin, so that they're ready to be taken out into the woods and installed. And then I also was playing with some of the materials that I commonly use, which are building materials or things you find in homes. Just, you know, when a house is abandoned or when it's being demolished, there's, you know, the building materials that the house is made of, like wood and insulation and concrete, but there's also often the decorative things like curtains and blinds and wallpaper, and some of those sorts of things also get left behind. So I'm taking some of those things and combined them in ways that would, you know, if it was really a rock sitting on insulation, that insulation would be weighed down more. Like this insulation couldn't actually hold up the rock in the way that it is now. It would be kind of squashed. So I'm kind of combining them in a way where these objects that would kind of damage each other or rub up against each other are now kind of like in a balance or found a stability because they've been cast. And also sort of these items that are kind of discarded, like when you leave a home and you leave the blinds, you're discarding the blinds, you're discarding, like, you know, the insulation, like it's like objects that we don't put a lot of romantic ideations around, that we don't necessarily love, that are very commonplace, but then casting them, you know, in these sort of precious materials that now elevate it, which I think is an interesting, you know, reflection right now on, you know, bronze statues and kind of the settler mentality, colonial mentality really that we see around us. So these are cast in what's called a cold cast bronze. So it is a bronze powder that you suspend in resin, and then you put a thin coat over the inside of your mold, and then you back it up with like just black resin, and then with foam actually in the end. So it's very thin and light, but it will patina just like bronze. It is a bronze. But then in places, you know, the foam has sort of leaked out a little bit, and you can sort of see that it's a little bit of a farce, and a little bit of a joke. So this is another one. So this piece of plywood, like a conch wouldn't necessarily grow on plywood because the formaldehyde glue kind of damages the mycelium. So the mycelium might go in a certain depth and you get like a small mushroom, but you would never get one this large kind of growing on a piece of plywood. And then, you know, a rock and plywood kind of also rub up against each other. And here then cast again in that cold cast bronze. And this is the third one that I did, which is actually like a ceiling tile that's made out of foam that would never hold up that rock. The rock is much too heavy for the ceiling tile, so I had to cast it lying flat and then stand it in order to assemble the mold. So the mold has been kind of messed with to kind of allow it to stand like this. And again, there's a bit of foam kind of leaking out to show the falseness of the bronze. And I've also cast them all in a gypsum cement that I've dyed to look like cement. So this is a very strong but light and brittle form. And again, I've put gold and silver leaf in places to sort of highlight this preciousness, or that you know, this preciousness that gets ascribed to certain things.
What is the scale of these, Emily? We have someone who's wondering.
Yeah, so they're nice tabletop, kind of almost bust sized, I would say. Like this one is, you know, the piece of insulation that's on the bottom is like a 16-inch by 16-inch kind of piece, and then it probably stands 24 inches tall. These ones are, you know, probably about 24 inches tall, but smaller. Like, you know, they're like, you know, very, very much like a bust sized kind of piece.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there, you know, I'm working in small tabletop size, which is kind of new for me and kind of refreshing on my body that usually is making very large things. And then, yeah, also kind of drawing and playing with some of the peat inks, which is made of soil, made of peat, which is, you know, and really enjoying kind of just playing with different ways of like moving your head as you draw, or blind contours and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's that's what I was working on in the Griffin studio. And yeah, are there any questions about any of that? I you know, I don't know if it's really, I can talk more about kind of what plans are for those materials moving into resource extraction towns in BC, or if there's other questions, I'm happy to sort of open it up for.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. That was so great. And I'd love to hear more about the plans for the materials as you move through the next stage of the process. And maybe we could just invite audience members to jump in with their questions anytime. But yeah, feel free to expand. We'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so far I have plans to go to Sandon, which is in the Kootenays. And it's a silver mining town that actually has a working small scale hydroelectric dam in it that actually powers the town and feeds power back into the grid, which is quite amazing. Um, and it was a town of 5,000 people at its peak, and there's now 6 people that live in the town. And there still is like a little bit of silver. And this town was they built like the main street on either side of a river, which is just like, I just love the hubris of that. So, of course, once every 5 years or so, the river would jump its banks and flood the town. Like they had a boardwalk over the river so that people could like drive their like, horse-drawn carriages through the town. But the river would jump its banks and wash that boardwalk out and flood the building. So instead of sort of, they rerouted they used dynamite to reroute the river around the town, and so you can see the bed of the old river and then where the road is now, and then there's the river new location just kind of behind the main street there. So that's one of the towns that I'm interested in working in. There's quite a few log cabins that have sort of collapsed in and around there, and I have been in touch with a few of the folks, like of the 5 people that still live there. And I'm hoping to go there and bring these conchs and also do some other kinds of work with the silver mining, like the little houses that are still there. I'm also, looking at some of the gold rush towns up in the Caribou, and potentially also thinking about heading to Ocean Falls, which is a pulp and paper town on the coast, kind of near Bella Coola. So those are kind of the plans so far, and yeah.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll jump on here again just to invite anyone. Feel free to put up that yellow hand and I can just go in and give you the opportunity to unmute. But I'm also happy to read questions out loud if anyone wants to pop them in the Q&A. But yeah, those images were just so incredible, Emily. Thanks so much for sharing. And one question that I actually had was in the images of the houses that they're just such striking interventions. And I wondered, I mean, they're beautiful photographs, and seeing them in the gallery space enlarged like that is also just such an immersive way to present them. And I was just curious if they were ever initially presented as kind of sculptural works where people had an opportunity to visit the sites in person, or if they were documentary works as kind of the intended.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And I would have I did get the opportunity in Halifax, or in Cape Breton, to open up the houses to folks to come in and see it. And I'm hoping here in Newfoundland as well that we'll be able to we're planning to have an open house and have people kind of come into a few of them here. It really is amazing to kind of get to see them in person, but there's liability issues, and there's also just accessibility issues. Like some of them are so far away that it's just, there aren't people kind of around, or not many, at least on the prairies. And then in Vancouver on the Lower Mainland, I only get 4 days between when they say I'm allowed in and when the house is knocked down. So there's just no time. So yeah, it is always a challenge to find a way to kind of like the intervention really, to me, is the artwork, is then how to present that so that you still get that same feeling that you get if you were to go into the house is always the challenge. Like I'm always trying to communicate that same feeling you have in the house. There's a little bit of disgust, there's a little bit of curiosity, there's some wow, but there's also some and you feel a little bit unsafe often. So trying to communicate that in the larger scale, or that's why the artwork is always at a larger scale, but always trying to communicate that in the work that goes to the gallery. So that's always the interpretation process. That's always a challenge.
Yeah, it's amazing though, because it really does come across in those installation shots in the gallery where you've painted the walls pink in some cases, or really started to kind of reflect the space of the house, and then the blown up photographs. Yeah. We have a question here from Lisa, who is wondering about your research into the archives of these towns as you work with them.
Yeah, I I do make a very concerted effort to not just like drop in and bring, you know, my own assumptions or whatever, but I really do try to integrate a little bit into the town in whatever way that I can. So often a lot of these small towns, they do have museums and archives, and I'll spend time in there like reading and learning about the area. But then also I make a real effort to just like chat with people and kind of find folks who like, oh, like, you know, like I went to like on the Prairies, I went to a women's dice night, where they, you know, a bunch of the farm women from the area were playing dice, and I joined in and, you know, was able to sort of like get some stories from them about the houses, or, oh yeah, I remember that was, you know, so and so's house, and they, you know, have stories and narratives about it. And as well, you know, here in Newfoundland, I've been, you know, chatting with lots of folks and really trying to learn, you know, as much as I can about the house and about the town and about the, you know, the area. But it's, you know, the museums and archives are great. They usually have a lot of information, but they're not the full picture. There's often a lot of things that are left out, particularly histories of women and histories of not white people, are often not there. So it is, I do find it good to balance, you know, the like official archive with just chatting with neighbors and, you know, looking around in the gardens for what was growing there, and, you know, sort of, I'm sure a lot of just my own imagination and my own as well, but I do try to, you know, find some empathy, some humanity kind of within the stories. And there's lots, like that's an easy thing to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. And do you find when you're on site in a town, especially some of these towns that are so small, that there's kind of a buzz around the project and you get a lot of people kind of poking around who are curious to learn more? And does that become kind of a conversation just by happenstance?
Yes, especially kind of on the East Coast. And I assume it'll be like this in the ghost towns of BC too. On the Prairies, they're, you know, definitely less so. The Prairies, because it's very, very isolated and these houses are in the middle of nowhere. And I think, you know, I don't know, it's interesting. I don't know. The farmers are busy and they're just like, yeah, sure, use the house, whatever. And then like, you know, there's not a lot of curiosity into it, but I've definitely found, or, you know, when I'm in the Lower Mainland as well, and in those homes, kind of lots of neighbors will come poke in, like, what are you doing? You know, stuff like that. So that's always fun.
Yeah, amazing. It was so wonderful to see those images of the sculptural works that you were working on at Griffin, and kind of to hear you talk about the process of it, you know, appearing as this bronze sculpture when kind of just below the surface there's foam starting to ooze and it becomes kind of like a stage prop.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that those will be installed in kind of interventions you're envisioning for your
Well,
next project.
I'm not sure if those ones will be. They're more like experiments into like objects, or like kind of creating sculptures that might. I'm not sure that those particular bronze ones, how exactly I will use those. It's more of a, yeah, those ones were more of a like, huh, let's like just study the materials that I'll be encountering and find other ways to sort of explore those materials, since we were all stuck at home for COVID and I couldn't go out to any houses or out to any communities. I was just thinking about, okay, what can I do with just the raw materials kind of in my studio? So that was kind of the what I kind of came up with there for that. But I'm not totally sure what I'm going to do with those or what I will use those for, in, you know, officially kind of a thing. So
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. So awesome to get kind of a sneak into the process, and what a neat way to kind of reflect some of the documentary aspects of photography, but in sculptural form.
yeah, totally. And it was just so lovely to work at the Griffin. Like it's such a nice, light, open space. It was just really lovely to kind of go up there and just sort of make these sculptures and sort of have a think about, you know, it was a very meditative space. So it was really lovely.
That's
very appreciated it. Yeah.
And yeah, I wonder if maybe you could, I know you and I were chatting a bit before, but maybe give us a scoop as to what you're up to in Newfoundland and what you're working on currently, because you kind of just jumped right from one studio to the next, which is
yeah.
exciting.
Yeah, it was really exciting. I really did not expect to be able to come to Newfoundland this summer. This residency was planned well before COVID. So I'm here and then I figured, oh, it's not going to happen. And so I made all these plans to go to these ghost towns in BC this summer. So I'll have to put that off till next summer, which is nice to have that all kind of teed up as well. But yeah, so I'm in Newfoundland, and I'm here for a full 6 weeks. So the first 3 weeks of which I'm traveling around to 4 different kind of communities to make work in abandoned houses here. And then the last 3 weeks I'll be back in St. John's in a studio space, kind of combining that, what I've made in the small towns, into artwork that will be shown with the Eastern Edge Art Gallery in St. John's. So we started off on the Avalon Peninsula in a town called Winterton, and there's this beautiful abandoned house where the whole back half is like actually fallen off, but it was definitely the most sketchy house I've worked inside of. I've worked on the outside of some sketchy falling down ones, but so far I haven't actually entered into any that where the roof is no longer there and the floor is barely there. But there was one part that was still safe, so we worked in there. And now I'm in Bonavista I'm making work. There's over 90 houses here. There's an organization called Bonavista Living, and they are buying up all these old unused houses and renovating them and then trying to revitalize the town. So they're restoring them back to kind of this original, super like so cute it almost hurts kind of little houses with like, some of them are like purple and some of them are pale yellow with blue trim. Like they're just like, the Newfoundland cliche that we all see on the airplane when we travel. And they're restoring them all and then kind of getting a lot of like arts and crafts. There's a lot of studios for artists. So lots of artists from St. John's will also come up and have a house up here, a little tiny house with a studio. There are plenty of artists who live here year round as well. And they're kind of revitalizing it into like a tourist town. And I mean, it's a great place to tour to. Like yesterday, we went for a big long hike, and we saw, as we were looking at like puffins on this like rock, super cute puffins, like a whale just like surfaced right beside the puffins. We're like, oh my gosh! Like it was just like So I highly recommend traveling to Bonavista if you are ever traveling to Newfoundland. And then from here, I have a contact on Fogo Island, so I'll be going there and making work in at least one house on Fogo Island, and then over to Corner Brook. And we'll hopefully get to spend some time in Grossmorn Park, just like checking it out too. So, and then back to St. John. So yeah, it's been really great to kind of be here. I also, Eastern Edge did this amazing thing when we weren't sure with COVID if I was going to be able to come. They actually hired someone to be my proxy and to do some of the scouting of the houses ahead of time. And now she's coming with us on this part of the trip as well. So I sort of feel like I have like a Newfoundland interpreter as well, who can kind of help me with like getting to know folks. And like, she's already made some connections with some folks. So then she has people to introduce me to. So, I think we have a bonfire tonight with some people. So we're kind of getting plugged right into that community again, which is really essential and would take a very long time if I didn't have Drew with me here to kind of help. So
yeah, that sounds incredible. What an exciting 3 weeks you have ahead of you. Mm-hmm. I'll jump in. I have more questions for you, but I do just want to again shout out to anyone. Feel free to jump in with your questions. Feel free to raise a hand and I can unmute you as well. But
just comments too, if anybody, it doesn't have to be super formal, but
if you just want to join the conversation, we can get you we can unmute you. So please just let us know. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the process, not only kind of the technicality of cutting through house materials, where a part of me is just kind of has no idea how you do it, but also kind of how you arrive at those interventions. Is it more you arrive and you kind of get an intuitive feel for kind of the interventions you want to do, or is kind of sketching it out part of your process as well? I'm curious just to learn more about how that unfolds.
Yeah, so often, like I said, when I was working in the Lower Mainland, like it's a very small turnaround time. So I get a very short amount of time. So you do have to be quite intuitive. And I just kind of go in and I look for that human trace, or that, whether that's in the trades or whether that's in the people who live there. and often it's not too hard to find. Like I find that I can kind of quickly identify it, or else I can't. And then I just kind of give up on that house. But the ones that I've worked in, it's usually been a pretty quick, like, okay, I can do this. And I think, you know, as I'm practicing getting better at it, the ideas do come a little bit faster. But at the same time, when I do have to travel to do them, I do like to do some research ahead of time so that I do have at least a few ideas kind of in my back pocket. And then I don't always know, like I'll have a few ideas of like, okay, these are some of the things I could do, but I don't know which house I'll do them in. So I sort of, you know, I like look at the house and okay, this idea would work at this house, or this idea modified in this way will work in this house. And that kind of a thing. So it is, you know, and I spend a lot of time just even on Google Maps ahead of time, like just walking the streets of the town on Google Maps, just to kind of like
Amazing.
get the feel for the town and that kind of a thing. And then with in this case, you know, like in the Prairies, I flew out and I scouted myself ahead of time. Because of COVID, I wasn't able to do that here in Newfoundland, but then Drew has been scouting and sending me heaps and heaps of photos. And, you know, we pepper her with questions and she, you know, does her best to find the answers as well. And so there's a little bit of both. It's definitely some planning because I just have too much anxiety to not plan at all. But then a lot of I would say more of it is intuitive kind of a thing. And I just bring like I just emptied out the tool library in St. John's with like I have like 8 different types of saws and all the tools.
Wow, I was curious because it looks so crisp and clean, the end product, but that can't be easy to be cutting through all of those layers of built material. Do you have a team on site help like working with you, or is it very hands-on, like you with your tools?
It's like yes, I have a team. Like my son and my partner come with me, but I'm the main tool person. I get most I'm too I'm the one who kind of has the better skill set for actually like using the saw. So I do the harder stuff and I get them doing the less technical bits of it. So also I feel responsible that if someone gets hurt, it really ought to be me. So I'll take on the more like grunty things kind of a thing. But
that's amazing. That's a massive undertaking.
I mean, I don't think I mentioned in this talk that I grew up, my father is a home builder. So we grew up, he was a building contractor. So I grew up building houses alongside my father. So that a lot of my knowledge is kind of comes from that. So I do have a bit of an idea of what a load bearing wall is, etc. So that helps.
And how does it feel? I mean, having these huge, massive products that are so ephemeral, they're about to be demolished. So I wonder kind of, how does that feel, the cycle being in some points like so quick? You mentioned even just a few days where you're putting in all this work and then it's just demolished.
Yeah, well, I do think there's like a little bit of a performative piece to this where it is a bit of a performance that is kind of ephemeral. And again, I think this is why I'm drawn to things like mushrooms and conchs that are part of this cycle. And I do kind of understand that it is a cycle, but at the same time, I am very cognizant of the fact that every time we make a habitat for ourselves, we're destroying the habitats of other creatures. And it does feel like we're quite wasteful. So, you know, there's a sadness there and a bit of an empathy, but I mean, a lot of the houses, I don't feel sad that they're disappearing. Like they are, it is, some of them, it's time, they're falling down, they're ugly, they're, you know, it's okay. But there's a balance there. I think that, you know, there's a bit of waste that kind of can break my heart a little bit occasionally, but.
And a lot of the homes being older homes and perhaps built at a time when, you know, they were just being built by the homeowners as opposed to like professional contractors. I wonder if that's something you've noticed as you cut through like little like quirkiness of like, oh, this is a handmade object that someone built for themselves 100 years ago.
Absolutely. The ones in Horseshoe Bay in particular was very clear. And then just the one we just did in Winterton here, the studs were actually like 2x2s. And they were somewhere between like 8 and 10 inches apart, like just kind of random distances apart from each other. and there was like zero insulation in the walls, like nothing. There was like, and I don't know. I think Newfoundland's cold. I don't understand, but there was probably 8 to 10 layers of wallpaper on the inside, and I guess that's what they thought of as insulation. I don't know. At least on the prairies, like even the old houses on the prairies had newspaper or like straw. But there was nothing in the two of the houses I worked on here so far. So it's
Wow.
quite something. And it's really, I really do, like, I have like an insatiable curiosity as to how things were built, and I'm really always like drilling holes and like poking into the walls to like take a look at like, how do they do this, how do they do that, what kind of wires they using, what kind of pipes. And
Yeah.
I bet not many people would find it interesting, but I do. So,
Yeah, no, it is fascinating, and it is, especially these older homes. I feel like would just find kind of so many little quirks and surprises as you cut through the layers of material. That's amazing, but also shocking. No insulation in Newfoundland. I can't imagine.
yeah, me either. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your talk today and your presentation, Emily. And it's been so incredible to see not only kind of the larger picture of your practice, but also those in progress shots from Griffin. So amazing to see. So we'll look forward to seeing it develop further. And yeah, I'll look forward to seeing your projects emerge throughout your Newfoundland residency. How exciting. So yeah, just thank you for your time and for sharing today. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting, Jen. It's lovely.
All right, well, thanks to everyone who joined, and wishing you an amazing trip and an amazing residency, Emily.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.